If there's one invention that's responsible for most of the advances in human society, it's probably the wheel. It's been around for thousands of years and is so ubiquitous that it's hard to imagine how humans ever managed without them. But what if we never did invent the wheel? What would our world be like today? Would we even have cars at all? Let's find out. First things first, let's address the big elephant in the room. Without wheels, there'd be no wheeled vehicles of any kind, meaning no cars, no trucks, no buses, no bikes, no motorcycles, no lawnmowers, no shopping carts, no luggage, no wheelchairs, no roller skates or rollerblades, and no tires or tubes. The very definition of a wheel is a circular device that rotates on an axle to ease the movement of a vehicle over a surface, replacing the need to lift the vehicle up and move it in jerks. In other words, nothing could ever move again unless it was carried or towed by another vehicle, which is an inefficient use of energy. And this isn't just limited to vehicles. Wheelbarrows are useful for moving all sorts of loads, especially at airports, warehouses, factories, and construction sites. And these are just the obvious uses of wheels. There are lots of intricate machines that contain smaller wheels or gears within them. So, without the wheel, there'd be no cameras, computers, clocks, watches, zippers, record players, cassette players, CD players, turntables, typewriters, pinball machines, vending machines, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, power tools, skateboards, scooters, go-karts, merry-go-rounds, Ferris wheels, hot air balloons, potter's wheels, or spinning wheels. We can only imagine how many more inventions wouldn't have been possible without the wheel. In fact, the lack of wheels would likely cause major setbacks across every industry. Hospitals would struggle to move patients. Food supplies would spoil since they couldn't be moved or refrigerated. Factories couldn't produce goods efficiently. Factories couldn't receive raw materials, so there'd be no convenient means of mass communication or travel. People would have to walk everywhere, okay? And a trip that took 30 minutes by car might take several hours on foot. But it doesn't end there. Since there'd be no efficient way of transporting goods, it's unlikely that global trade would ever exist. Nations would be isolated and dependent on their own natural resources, which in turn would drastically limit their industrial capacity and economic growth. Now add in the fact that people would also have to walk everywhere, and you've got yourself a pretty sedentary lifestyle. This means that people would likely live shorter lives filled with health problems caused by a lack of physical activity. Also, the distance that someone could travel in a day would determine how far their influence could reach. In other words, ideas and cultures would remain localized, preventing the kind of globalization that we have today. In such a world, it's possible that no global conflicts would ever occur, although the bickering between local factions would likely be even more intense. In this hypothetical world, warfare would involve men with swords and spears fighting on foot, so battles would be much slower and less deadly than modern-day warfare. Speaking of warfare, it's unlikely that a centralized military would exist without the wheel, so there'd be no standing armies or navies. Instead, there'd be militias consisting of able-bodied men from each village or city. It's also unlikely that there'd be any high-rise buildings. Cranes aren't strong enough to lift building materials to great heights, so the tallest structures would be the ones that were built using brute force, like the pyramids. In fact, the Egyptians and other ancient cultures might have achieved much greater things had the wheel been invented earlier. As it is, the wheel was invented independently in several different civilizations during roughly the same time period. But where exactly did the wheel come from, and why was it invented in the first place? The first known wheels were discovered in Mesopotamia in the southern part of modern-day Iraq, although similar wheels were later found in Slovenia, dating back to roughly the same time period. At first, the wheels were attached to larger vehicles called dollies, which were essentially sleds on wheels used for transporting goods. The earliest evidence of wheeled vehicles dates back to 1800 BC, which is not long before the first crude chariots appeared. Before long, the wheel was attached to horse-drawn carts, and eventually to actual vehicles powered by teams of oxen. It wasn't long after that the wheel replaced animal power with horse-drawn carriages and eventually automobiles. From here, the advantages of the wheel quickly became apparent. Vehicles could cover more ground in less time, carrying more weight further than was possible by walking or using pack animals. The ability to easily transport goods led to specialization, which caused cities to grow. It's also made it easier to wage war, although there's some debate about whether the wheel actually increased warfare. Some historians argue that since weapons like bows and arrows came before the wheel, the development of wheeled vehicles didn't significantly improve the effectiveness of militaries. Others counter that wheeled chariots were superior to horse-riding warriors and therefore more effective. Either way, the wheel had an enormous impact on early civilizations, allowing them to grow, develop, and spread. The wheel is one reason why Western civilization has become so dominant, but it's certainly not the only reason. For more on the subject, check out our series on why the West won. So, what would happen if the wheel was never invented? Well, we know that transportation and trade would be heavily disrupted, but what about daily life? Well, imagine this. You wake up bright and early, put on your clothes, which are slightly different because there's no zippers, and head downstairs to eat breakfast. Your food, which has traveled fewer miles and taken longer to prepare, tastes slightly different. You grab your appers, which is harder than usual because there's no electric motor, and crank up the radio. Without electric wires, radios would have a much shorter range. You listen to your favorite song and contemplate how good life would be if someone invented a teleportation device. You grab your satchel and head to the corner store to buy some groceries. On the way, you pass by a group of merchants who are carrying their wares on their backs. You stop to chat for a while because there's no cars. The streets are full of pedestrians. You have to wait until a group of horses pull their carriage past you before continuing on your way. When you finally reach the store, you realize that some items are out of stock because they were unable to be transported. You purchase what you need and head home. On the way, you have to dodge puddles and dirt because there's no paved roads. If it were raining, you'd have to wait until it stopped because there's no such thing as an umbrella. You get home safely and prepare dinner. Afterwards, you sit down and write in your journal by candlelight, wishing you could send a message through the ether to someone halfway around the world. But alas, the telegraph hasn't been invented yet. You lie down in your bed frame made of solid wood, free of any fancy finishes, and fall asleep. In the morning, you wake up early because there's no alarm clock. After finishing your breakfast, you grab your wooden bucket filled with water and head to the communal bathroom. Without plumbing, bathing facilities would be rudimentary at best. After doing your business, you return home and prepare yourself for work. You don't bother shaving because there's no such thing as a razor. You grab your lunch and head off to work. Because there's no cars, most people will walk to work or carry on deliveries on their back. Others will travel by horse. Working conditions are poor because factory owners can't afford to install electricity. All products must be made by hand or with animal power. Because there's no refrigeration, everyone must work around the clock to keep up with demand. And working conditions are dangerous since there are no government regulations to ensure safety. After a hard day's work, you return home and relax. No, there's no television or internet, so you read a book by candlelight. You eat some dinner, then lie down in your unfinished bed frame and drift off to sleep. That was a typical day in pre-wheeled history, and it's clear that the absence of the wheel would be catastrophic. The wheel provided the foundation for many other inventions and innovations. It helped us explore the world, trade with others, build new technologies, and wage war. Without it, we'd likely still be living in small villages, afraid of the outside world. Thanks for watching.